Good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. I'm Gene Paranak. Today is episode 58, Friday, May 21st, 2021. Thank you for all your thoughts and prayers. As you know, it's been a hard time for our family recently with birth and complications with our newborn, but he's doing well. So thank you all for being here and thank you for your patience with a few hiccups in the communications about the show. Today, we're going to have the COVID news as usual. After that, I want to review some of MedTech Crossroads stats and new announcements with you. We've got some cool things coming up on the show in the future. And May is Medical Device Development Month. We've been talking once per week about a medical device development topic. This week, right out of personal experience recently, we're going to talk about usability. We've talked about usability before, but I want to link for you the actual things that FDA says with some things that we've experienced personally. When the pulse oximeter fails, even though it's working, we'll talk about that in just a minute as well. After that, question and answer, as well as any other things that you want to tell us about the community. We welcome your thoughts and your comments at the end of the show. So with that, COVID metrics and vaccine distribution. As you know, COVID seems to be dropping dramatically in the country and in Michigan. This came across my desk from the New York Times this morning. Good morning. The pandemic may now be in permanent retreat in the U.S. Well, that would be wonderful if it's true. They call it a momentous day. And the numbers do seem to bear this out. The confirmed new COVID-19 admissions per 100 inpatient beds per county. Sadly, our dear state of Michigan is still very last, and yet it's out of the red. The admissions have dropped. Most of the country is in the green. This really is truly wonderful news. And so we continue to follow that. But I want to bring this up again, and this is a little bit for posterity at this point, because you'll remember for the last number of weeks, we've shown this chart of our dear state of Michigan that has been at very, very high community transmission levels. So we need to hold these two things in our minds. The fact that COVID is dropping in Michigan and elsewhere, and the fact that Michigan has recently, in recent weeks, probably the last 6 weeks, led the nation in transmission. There is transmission across the country. This means that the disease is still transmitting at a level that the CDC considers to be the highest level in the state of Michigan. So I think this is something that we're not hearing getting reconciled in our news reporting, because it is transmitting like wildfire throughout much of the country, especially the state of Michigan. We'll see what that ends up meaning in coming months and years. But we are very thankful for the remission in the hospitalizations. We are thankful that it looks like 46.8% of our total population of the country has received at least one dose of one of the vaccines. And you see the other numbers there. There's 36% of the total population fully vaccinated. And the vaccination numbers continue to drop. We had a straight line going up to about April 8th. Now that number continues to drop down, indicating that perhaps many of the people who want to be vaccinated have been. And we'll see where that goes. So these three bits of information, I think, really, really interesting. That the spread, especially in our state of Michigan, continues unabated of COVID, yet hospitalizations are down, and vaccinations continue to happen, although not at the rate they were happening. We will find out in months and years what this actually means, but those are the facts as we have them today. Let's get into some of our local news. The Detroit New Apprentice Network, this from our friends at TechTown, telling us this virtual gathering for employers taking place on Wednesday, May 26th of this year from 2:30 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. And this is a joint venture between Accenture, Rocket Companies, Wayne State, TechTown Detroit, and the City of Detroit, and other partners joining forces with additional local organizations. To activate this employer-led initiative, they're looking for others to join the network. They want to have a direct, positive, and long-term impact on our local economy by providing career opportunities to individuals who are facing economic vulnerability. Whatever else has happened, we can all agree that the pandemic has put a lot of people in some very bad places, especially in terms of their jobs and in terms of their finances. So this sounds like a really good opportunity to talk about it as employers. And they will talk about the network that they're trying to establish, and they'll have other ecosystem partners join. There's an email below if you'd like more information on that. Again, this coming from our friends as a news item out of Techtown, Detroit. Thanks to Paul Reiser for that. Into Being is still looking for an embedded systems developer, microcontroller firmware design, and user interface software. We would love to talk to you. Lots to do here. And starting next week, our judges are going to be back. They're going to be talking to us still as part of our May Medical Device Development Month about what they don't like to see in startups. When you hear a pitch and it contains the following, oh, I don't like to hear that. And we'll talk a little bit about that, the negative things that you can hear out of pitches and what we wouldn't want to hear. After that, in the month of June, we're going to be talking with a number of startups pitching, as we have done before on the show, this time for a $2,500 quarterly prize that'll be awarded at the end of June. And it's the MedTech Crossroads Pitch Party. Each startup will have 10 minutes to talk about their product, their concept. Our judges here, Andy Rader, Dr. Nikki Kennedy, Jim Metzger, and Stacy Frankovich, will reflect on those. And at the end, they'll tip their hat towards one of those startups who will receive a $2,500 prize. Not a great amount of money in the grand scheme of things, but for many early stage startups, just what they need to get that next step done. Here's the plan. 10 minutes at the end of a June show from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. And near the end of the quarter, we'll select a winner. The pitch decks can be sent to pitchparty@medtechcrossroads.org. We're going to pick a few startups to participate, and the PowerPoint needs to cover these areas: problem statement, vision, value proposition, team, milestones, business model, competitors, and the ask, or functionally equivalent areas. Since we've waited till the month of June because of some of the complications here at the end of May, we may double up on a few startups. So if you have folks who are interested in competing, please send them our way. Bring them to that address that you see there, pitchparty@medtechcrossroads.org to be eligible. Also, if you go to the Into Being website, all of the FDA education segments that you might be interested in finding can be found on the website under webinars, under MedTech Crossroads, FDA education. You can find those there. We've talked about many topics over the last 58 episodes, and we'll continue to talk about more. And probably the last time we'll announce this, but the MEDC is looking for companies, medical device companies, to help represent Michigan at Medical Design and Manufacturing West Expo in Anaheim, California, apparently happening in person. And they are looking for folks in optical instrument and lens manufacturing, electromedical and electrotherapeutic apparatus manufacturing, analytical laboratory instrument manufacturing, surgical and medical instrument manufacturing, surgical appliance and supplies manufacturing, and dental equipment and supplies manufacturing, as well as ophthalmic goods manufacturing. They're going to bring 6 companies with them to that show, give them some booth space, it sounds like, and help those companies to help to represent the state of Michigan. So if you want to reach out about that, Tino or Mark would probably love to hear from you at those emails on the screen there. And we'd love to see you there at MDNM West Expo. Well, next up, I want to talk to you about MedTech Crossroads. As you know, we got started when the pandemic started, and we had many, many people calling in because we were all trying to connect with each other. And so was born MedTech Crossroads. At the time, we called it COVID Connect. Now, over the course of the last year and some, I want to share with you some statistics about the show, things that we've been able to accomplish together. Well, as you know, today is the 58th show, 58 shows, more than a year of shows in. 60 plus hours of content now on YouTube from these shows, all marked up based on the person who we were interviewing, or the topic we were talking about, or the education that we were doing, or the announcements that we were making. That's all on YouTube. You can get to it through our website, or you can search it on YouTube. 80,000 YouTube impressions. Hey, we're not going to be the next viral video, but it's really going somewhere. And we're approaching 7,000 views as well. So it is a niche, but it's a growing niche, and one that we're really excited to be doing with you. Thank you to our live listeners for being part of this. We've had more than 100 guests on the show, and this is one of the core parts of what we're trying to do at MedTech Crossroads, is to really bring the community together, to give in-depth looks at people who are doing the work of med device development, delivery of medical technology, investing in it, and other things. So where do we go from here? Well, here's the cool thing that's going to be happening in the near future. We're establishing the MedTech Crossroads Oversight Committee. And this is a group of well-connected individuals in our ecosystem to help us chart a course for the future of the show. Because, as always, we're keeping a pulse on healthcare providers, insurers, developers like ourselves at Into Being, startups, business development entities. We just had Phil Santer from Ann Arbor Spark on. Paul Reiser from TechTown just sent in the news for today. Investors as well, because they're an integral part of this ecosystem. Service providers who do things like packaging and sterilization and assembly and more. And to keep that process happening, we're bringing this oversight committee together to help us plan, to help us say, hey, we should be talking to this person, we should be talking to that person. Here's how we could get a broader picture of where we're going, both in Michigan and more broadly. We're looking for ways to make our view wider than ever. And we want your help with that too. So as soon as today, as soon as this show, at the end of the show during our Q&A, I'd really like to hear from you. If there's anything that you can tell us about individuals in the ecosystem that you believe we should be interviewed, things you'd like to hear more of, parts of the show that you've really enjoyed and want us to double down on, we'd love to hear from you. As we did in the month of May, we'll probably focus future months on certain topics. So for example, to interview doctors for a month, to interview investors for a month, to interview service providers, be they manufacturers or sterilizers, for a month, so that we can start to get broad swaths of our industry surveyed and bring them to you so that when you want somebody to talk to, you know who to go to. But at the end of today's show, I'd love to hear from you. In the Q&A, feel free to raise your hand or put it into the Q&A in the chat box and give us your thoughts on that. Well, as we said before, May is Medical Device Development Month at MedTech Crossroads. We first covered it's compelling, but does it work? We talked about the Cynefin framework and ways to look at development as a method of reducing uncertainty, discovering and reducing unknowns. Really, really important. And if you don't understand this, if you're in the investment world or you're in the management world, it's really, really critical that you start to understand this. Also, if you're a developer, it's critical you understand this so that you can communicate to those around you where you are in the process. The real meaning of development iteration came next as we looked at ways to optimize development iterations, where is value add and where is just putting too much into a given iteration. After that, we looked at the concept of objective evidence, looking at what the FDA really expects to see when they walk through your doors. And objective evidence has a very distinct meaning, and there's important things to generate. There's also ways to sink yourself by generating documentation that's not relevant. You can go back and look at that on YouTube or through our webpage as well. Up until recently, today's show was a TBD, but we've got a title today. It's When the Pulse Oximeter Fails, Even Though It's Working. And this comes out of some very recent experience that we've had as a family in the hospital twice with our newborn, a lot of unknowns that were being reduced to knowns. And I want to talk to you about this today. Now, I got to say, this is not medical advice. We're talking about this strictly from a medical device development perspective. So please, go to the ER immediately if you suspect breathing issues in yourself or somebody that you love. This is not intended as a substitute for that, but we are going to talk about some cool technical things and regulatory things surrounding a specific type of device that many of us have come to know and either love or hate, which is the venerable pulse oximeter. It's a staple in any hospital suite. And what we're talking about today with regards to pulse oximetry is the question of usability. Usability is something we've talked about on the show many times. It's something near and dear to the FDA's heart. And the agency has been issuing guidance on an increasing basis Some of their initial guidance was little more than please think about usability. But why would they even say this? Why would usability be something that matters? Shouldn't we be just thinking about the technical details? Shouldn't we be thinking about the risks? Shouldn't our business people be thinking about marketability? Doesn't that suffice? Hey, we've got design controls. We went through the requirements. We'd listed the requirements. Isn't that enough? Well, FDA long ago recognized no, that's not enough. Because many times a product, even though it's on the market and even though it works, isn't usable, or its usability may be compromised in some way. Here's how the agency thinks about it. This from the FDA usability guidance. A device takes an input and ultimately gives an output while it's done some processing and reaction. Now, it may be very simple input and very simple output. It may just be a handpiece and you grab it and you do things with it. Well, that's almost a trivial example. But many devices in our increasingly connected age of software and electronics are actually doing computations. They're thinking about what they're receiving as input, and they're giving an output from there, this through a user interface. Really importantly, the user takes that information coming from the user interface, goes through a cognitive process. If they're a clinician, they're reacting based on what they understand about what that device should be doing, that they understand the condition of the patient, and they come to a conclusion and they make a control action, oftentimes back into the device, again, through the user interface. This is a pretty good capture of what happens as we interact with a medical device, whether we're a doctor, whether we're a patient, whether we're a parent. Usability is put throughout FDA's regulations. You've seen this many times if you've listened to the show. In 21 CFR 820, design input needs to include the needs of the user and the patient. Design verification needs to make sure that the performance criteria are met. Design validation is to ensure that devices conform to defined user needs and intended uses, and shall include testing of production units under actual or simulated use conditions. So usability has always been ensconced throughout this, and FDA continues to make it more specific and to talk more and more about it. So we're never going to escape from usability, but there's a lot of nuance about how we need to think about it. Here's the latest guidance from the agency on the topic of usability. Applying human factors and usability engineering to medical devices. This, the 2016 version, the draft of which was issued in 2011. And this is a rather comprehensive document. We won't go through all of it today. We've talked about parts of it on other shows. And in it, FDA is talking about how to approach usability. They go so far as to lay out how to evaluate usability, different types of evaluations that are performed during the usability engineering process. But it all comes down to some really basic concepts that start us out. We need to consider the users of the device. We need to consider the device use environment. And we need to consider the device user interface that you just saw in that previous slide. Now, just to give you some examples that we've talked about already, the user could be a clinician, it could be a doctor, it could be a nurse, it could be a tech. It could be used in a hospital or a home care setting or an ambulance, or it could be in a field setting. And the user interface could be anything from things that move manually in a physical device, or it could be something as complex as a touchscreen computerized interface. There's a million different permutations and combinations here. And even in a device class, we're talking today about pulse oximeters, there are many different nuances on each of these elements. So it's important to recognize that what we say today doesn't apply to all conditions. Well, as you're looking at usability and trying to figure out what should I be thinking about for my device, there are some really powerful resources. And today, we've listed 6 of these that the FDA is aware of, many of which are provided by the agency. And sorry for the eye chart here. The first one is the FDA's MAUDE database. We'll have a slide on that in just a second. The next is FDA's Medical Product Safety Network. And again, a slide in just a moment. After that, CDRH medical device recalls, as well as safety communications. There's a page from ECRI on medical device safety reports, and then the Joint Commission's Sentinel events page. If you're engaged in the business of developing medical devices, either as a startup, an inventor, an investor, a mentor, these are really important pages to have in front of you. When somebody comes to you and you're engaged in talking about them about a particular device class, do a quick scan. You might just find something. In fact, today when I was preparing this, I found a few really interesting things that we'll get to in just a minute. But first of all, FDA's MAUDE database is a venerable resource. You can search back through many, many years of records. They have a simple search bar there. And you can look and you can see if mandatory reporters have listed issues with the device in question. Mandatory reporters here include manufacturers, importers, and device user facilities like hospitals. And you'll find all sorts of things. You may be surprised what you find for many devices. This doesn't necessarily tell you that there was a true issue because it hasn't necessarily been vetted at that point. The status is usually available, but the nature of the error that's being reported is listed, and you can start to see trends when you look for a particular device class. They aren't all listed as usability errors, but as you'll see by looking at many of them have the potential to be usability errors. The next page, the MedSun Medical Product Safety Network at CDRH, Center for Devices and Radiological Health. A similar database and adverse event reporting program launched in 2002 by CDRH. You can find that through the FDA website as well, or at the link we had up earlier. Also, medical device recalls. It's important to know how devices have failed, what current issues users are seeing, but where has it gone so far as to be an issued recall? FDA has those records. Take a look at those medical device recalls at fda.gov. And this, the Joint Commission, this was actually a new one to me in going back through the guidance, but a sentinel event is defined as a patient safety event that results in death, permanent harm, or severe temporary harm. Sentinel events are debilitating to both patients and healthcare providers involved in the event, and the Joint Commission works closely with its organizations to address sentinel events and to prevent these types of events from occurring in the first place. So leaving the nuts and bolts of usability aside, there are processes that have to be gone through to look at the usability of a device. But what we're saying here is that there's many portals to look at adverse events for devices that are similar to the device you're working on. Look at those, absorb those, and make sure that makes it into your risk analysis process. Make sure that it makes it into your usability engineering process. Obviously, if you have information on your own device, that's great, but many of us are talking about devices that haven't yet made it to the market. So the best we can do is look at devices similar to us that already are on the market in similar classes. So here's a summary of usability considerations. We think about the users, the use environment, and the device interface. How that device is actually used leads to one of two outcomes. Either it's safe and effective for its intended use, or it's unsafe and ineffective. We have to look then through usability engineering at that device use itself to see if we're capturing what needs to be there in terms of device usability. Do we need to change the training of our users? Do we need to change the control layout? Do we need to relabel what's on the screens? Do we need to make any changes to our user manuals or instructions? The possibilities are endless, but that's what's really being looked at when it comes to usability. Now, I want to make two definitions for you. What's a pulse oximeter? Well, a pulse oximeter is a device usually worn on an extremity, hand or foot, to measure blood oxygenation. It's really good to know if there's oxygen in your blood. An ECG is a device that reads heart signals, usually via electrodes on the chest. It's an electrocardiogram. And if you've ever been in a hospital suite, you'll know that these two devices spend a lot of time on the patient and are the two primary things that you're looking at when you look at the monitor at bedside. They're critical, they're vital, and we're very thankful for the technology in both of these. We're also thankful for the application in the hands of skilled doctors and nurses who watch those monitors round the clock, and as I can attest, recently we'll be right in that room if one of those alarms goes off, trying to figure out exactly what's happening. So we're very thankful for this technology. We're very thankful for the people who use it. But it's very interesting because what we're talking about today is my own personal experience. And again, this is not medical advice, and I am not a clinician, but we do develop medical devices. And what we saw recently was infant bluing, when the periphery of an infant turns blue. Well, that's worthy of concern, isn't it? And again, as we said at the outset, if your infant or anyone you know is turning blue, please see a healthcare professional, go to the ER, get it looked at. That's exactly what we did. And as we spent time at the hospital, one of the things we noticed and were reminded of is that it's standard practice to effectively ignore pulse ox numbers if they disagree with ECG numbers. And that shouldn't alarm you. That is just normal, because the ECG is on the core. It's looking at what is happening with the heart directly through electrical signals. And out on the periphery is this device measuring oxygenation via light. It usually works wonderfully, but many times the data quality just isn't sufficient. And so it's written off as low quality data. In fact, the display often says this, low quality data. This happens many times per day in the hospital. And if you've ever been in the hospital and seen something on a patient's finger or toe or wrapped around a part of their body with a little red light glowing, you've seen a pulse ox. But as we've discovered, there's a world of information hidden inside those words, low quality. If we look at the MAUDE database for a very, very common portable pulse ox unit, we read things like this. Event description. The customer reported the device is reading the wrong numbers. Event description. The customer is not getting a steady signal or any signal at all. Event description. The customer reported the device is not reading correctly. Event description. The customer reported the device is not reading vitals correctly. Event description. The customer reported the numbers are off. Event description. The customer reported the device provided inaccurate readings. I only had to go through this last year's worth of data for one pulse ox model to find all of these and more related events. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? That our standard practice is, in fact, to ignore those readings very frequently. And it's a very common occurrence that people say, oh, it's not reading the right thing. Well, this isn't meant to alarm you in any way, shape, or form, because there's actually a technical reality behind all of this. And as developers, we need to ask the question, inaccurate? Compared to what? What is the gold standard? This is a question we always need to be asking with respect to the devices, especially diagnostics, that we're developing. What is inaccurate? What do you compare it to? Now, in the hospital, they have a good technique, and that is to compare it to the ECG readings. And when those disagree, we trust the ECG, and we tend to leave the pulse ox behind for that moment. If we need to do further studies, we do further studies. And that's a great way of looking at a patient. So we're very thankful for that. But here's something that's maybe not as widely known. There's a kid with drool running down his cheeks doing really well. That child has a core, and that child has a periphery. And those two are different because the ECG is looking at the core. The pulse ox is looking at the periphery. And while this may seem like an obvious statement, sometimes the ramifications aren't so obvious. Some observations that we've had during home use of a pulse oximeter. When the infant was grunting or straining, like all infants do, with a burp or a diaper, guess what? The pulse ox went bad, just for a moment. Then it came back. Far from bad data, it appeared that these numbers were correlated to straining, normal infant straining on the part of the child. Then we read this. In the user manual for the pulse ox unit, buried way the data, there is this. With neonates or infants, check that the peripheral blood flow to the sensor site is not interrupted. Interruption, for example, as may occur while lifting or crossing their legs during a diaper change. I wonder how many of us as parents or as clinicians know this fact. It's easy to write something off as bad data, but there's actually a science to it. When that thing isn't measuring peripheral blood flow, it could be mispositioned, as it says in the second bullet point on this page. Or it could be some dramatic event that we do need to intervene in, and that's why we're very thankful for skilled doctors and nurses looking at these numbers. But other times, it's just the patient bending their arms or legs and shutting off the blood flow temporarily to them. Why is this important, and why does this touch on the topic of usability? Well, remember what we said about the FDA and its perception of usability. The device takes an input and gives an output. We, as clinicians or users or parents or patients, take that output, we perceive it, we process it, and then we make a response to it. Sometimes we'll come in and we'll shut the alarm off. Sometimes we'll look at the child and we'll say something isn't right. We need to do something more, observe more. But here's the thing. To simply write something off as bad data may overlook an underlying reality that the device development company actually knows. It's information that's hidden. And this is exactly what the FDA is talking about when it comes to usability. Because we have a device where there's actually known risk information, there's actually known safety and efficacy information, but it's buried so far into the instructions for use of the device that it doesn't make it up to the common parlance. And so this interpretation loop that FDA recognizes doesn't get a fair shake because not all the information is readily available at the top level. You can interpret the information coming off a device and you can come to multiple conclusions. In one case, you may conclude that you've got bad data, so let's look elsewhere for the cause. But a secondary conclusion, depending on how the device is used and interpreted, may be that you have bad data, but that bad data is for a known reason, leading to a better understanding of the patient's condition. This is why usability is so critical. We're so thankful for skilled clinicians to interpret data. But I think this gives a case in point why FDA is concerned with usability of new devices, to help users understand what they're up against with the increasing complexity of data coming at them. And it's up to us as device developers, device companies, innovators, startups, to do that usability engineering, to look at these and ask, are we really getting that output through that user interface to the user in a way that they can correctly interpret? The answer will never be 100%, but that's our job, and that's what we need to be doing during the usability engineering process. So with that, I just wanted to conclude that segment. It's a somewhat shorter show today. I wanted to leave a little bit of time for comments and questions about what you've liked about MedTech Crossroads over the past year, and also what guests you believe we should have on as we continue to talk to innovators, inventors, doctors, clinicians of all types, investors, service providers, manufacturers, business development folks in our community, and everybody in between. Help us to understand that. If you have a comment, I would love to hear from you. We're going to give just a little bit of time for that. Please feel free to raise your hand. Also, if there's a community event coming up, we would love to hear from you. Tell us more about what is happening in the community, and we would be happy to put you on for a minute and let you tell us about that. We'll give just a minute more for that. I do thank you all for being here today. Oh, there's a question coming in. This from Valerie, to hear from investors. And we will answer that live. If there's any nuance on that you'd like to communicate with us, Valerie, feel free to. But yeah, more from investors. Of course, next week on the show, we're going to be having our judges come on. And we have an investor among our judges telling us more about what they don't like to hear from pitches. So that'll be part of it. But yeah, we'll take that and hear from more investors going forward. Any other comments as folks are thinking about this with us? We would love to hear from you. And this one about the usability, we'll come back to that in just a second. I'll ask for more investor or guest questions. And actually, we'll answer this question while we're waiting for other questions about the show. Question from Matthew. Hi, Gene. The example you raised for usability was limited to single users. How does usability validation differ if there are multiple users that use the device at the same time? Matthew, that is a great question. My first answer to that is I'm going to follow up with some of our team and get a better answer than the one I'm going to give you live, because there is undoubtedly stuff in FDA's guidance about how to consider that. But it's a very, very valid question. I'll tell you what I know about populations. I know that FDA really, really is big on population information for devices, because they've come to recognize that if I've proven something works for a certain population, whether it's users or patients, it won't necessarily work for others. And so you have to understand that they're going to have to validate each type. If you say it's usable in a setting, for example, a device that you use for hospital use, you can't just assume that it's good for home use. Another comment here in the chat. Yep, Peggy agrees. FDA requires each user group type to have their own testing. Couldn't agree more, Peggy. Thanks for that. Yeah, if there's more nuance you'd like to bring to that, we'd be happy to take that as well. But great question. And this is the thing. It used to be enough way back in the day to just kind of test the device, put it out there. No longer. Demographics matter. Use environment matters. And this is all becoming integrated. It's the integration of usability with things like risk analysis, 14971, even patient contacting electrical safety now begins to integrate all those questions together. So you're starting to see the standards linking together and really looking at how do these things interplay with each other. Usability isn't just a convenience. It's not just, did the device do what I hoped it would? It's actually a risk question, right? Because it's safety and effectiveness. So all these things interplay together. But great questions, great answers. Do you have any favorite resources for medical device usability training? Books, presentations, etc. We're trying to improve awareness across our entire development team. John, that's something that we do with folks on our team. We've got folks on our team who can do that. We've done a couple sessions on usability here. The FDA has a document which I believe was posted, but I'm just going to post into the chat right now, if you'll excuse my doing this live, that talks about the usability process, along with a few of the slides that we grabbed for today's session. I'm just posting that right now. So feel free to reach out, and we would be happy to talk with you more about usability and doing some training on that, which basically parallels the guidance. So feel free to reach out on that. Valerie, who I happen to know is a registered respiratory therapist, mentions that any movement can cause issues with readings in some pulse oximeters, and that very, very true. Yep. Interestingly enough, we were noticing these things even without movement, which was where the dig for the data in the IFU came. But a great, great comment. Let's see if we have any other questions or comments. Again, community events, you may not think it's important, but let me put it this way. If you're with a company or a business development organization or some other entity and something's coming up and you can tell us about that and we can announce it right now, we'd love to tell the community about it, bring more people together. It doesn't have to be something having to do with MedTech Crossroads or Into Being. We have to reiterate that. Anything happening in our community, large or small, that is of interest to a range of people in the MedTech community, feel free to bring it up and we will bring you live and let you talk about it. We've got this question from Karen Mehta. What are some of the best resources to teach medical device design and development in terms of user interface and user experience. Our team is small but hungry to learn. Again, Kieran, we'll follow up afterwards and talk about this. Here's the deal. There's lots of resources out there that have to do with user experience, right? In the days of the heyday of Apple, I think user experience was really born, and people have been doing great work on that ever since. And it's wonderful and it's great, and you should think about that. But here's the big but and the big gotcha. As we've talked about on this show many, many times, FDA has specific expectations about the development of your product, and those really come down to, among other things, the design control process. So things like usability and risk and user needs, as well as standards and other things, sometimes the standards include usability information, need to be incorporated into the development process. So a disjoint that often happens is people will go out and they'll hire an industrial design firm who makes beautiful pictures. They're wonderful, they're great, not knocking them at all. But until you learn to incorporate that part of the process into the design controls process, to look at how this device is being developed and whether we are addressing the usability issues, we haven't gotten there yet. Unless we've thought about failure modes that the industry is aware of, that's why we were talking earlier about usability in terms of the MAUDE database and the MedSun database and else, you can find out what kinds of issues people have been having with the particular type of device that you're dealing with. Also, as a part of the guidance that we didn't talk about today, but we can do offline, or maybe this is just telling us we'll do another session on usability. Another aspect is the fact that you actually have to have a usability engineering process. Now, there are international standards like 62366, but FDA's 2016 guidance that we referenced actually goes into a lot of this. And so you actually have to determine, how am I going to evaluate usability for this device? It can involve using users and patients to look at the use of a device or a phantom of the device, or some way evaluating what they have trouble with, and can they get all the way through the process. Now, let me give you an example like the one about this niche case of desaturations for an infant. I don't think, but I'm not a clinician, I don't think that most adults' pulse ox registers a desaturation when they just bend their arm a little bit. It can be motion artifacts up here, but it's not necessarily them shutting off the blood to their arm. And this happens to be a niche case in infants. Well, if you knew about this and you knew that this was something that was there, what might part of your usability testing be? It would be to design your usability engineering to incorporate that niche case, if you thought it was important, and to make sure that some percentage of your users were indeed able to identify that niche case in a simulation. It doesn't mean it has to be a clinical trial. This can be some form of final evaluation of the device, but it doesn't have to be a clinical trial necessarily. It just has to be captured in the development process, in the design controls process, captured in the usability engineering, and then evaluated. And if the clinicians that are developing the device and the developers that are working on the device have identified that there's a risk that we need to be able to mitigate, and it's a usability risk, we better make sure we're testing that in the usability testing. So I hope that helps. Feel free to reach out for more, and we can do some more education for you on that. We've got a couple more comments here. Thank you for these. There was recent reporting regarding inaccurate readings by pulse oximeters for people of color. Wow, great. This is good information. Are there efforts ongoing to address this discrepancy from the medtech sector? Seems like a usability human factors issue that was overlooked during the original development process. Shweta Madhur, thank you for that comment. Indeed, I do not have the specifics on that, but we are very much aware that different demographics, people of color and others, different ages, gender, etc., sex, they are often underrepresented in clinical trials. And what FDA has very recently been able to say very definitively is, if you didn't test it on the population, why do you believe that it's going to work for them? And so it's a very apropos question. I will take a look at that. If you have any information on that, Shweta, we'd be more than happy to hear from you. If there's a resource that talks about that, we love having a dialogue But I think you've put your finger on a big and important aspect in usability. Um, Again, another question from Karen there. Yeah, we'll follow up with some of the usability references that we've already had. We'd be happy to talk with you more offline about that. And if, as always, it sounds like this is a topic that generates interest, we may get some of our folks from Into Being on one of the future shows to talk about usability in more detail, because it sounds like there's a lot of interest in this. And we have another comment here from Matt. To make the question more specific, if multiple people interact with a device, such as during a surgery, when usability testing, have there been other experiences with testing users in each role or conducting usability testing with multiple users at once? This is a great question, Matt. And this is one that would have to come down to the device specifics. I think we can say that if a usability testing program were designed well, you would evaluate who the users of the device are. Let's take a surgical suite, for example. We all know that there are many personnel present in a surgical suite, and while it may be the primary surgeon who's doing the actual, let's say, cutting on the patient, there is a scrub nurse who is handing them the devices very frequently, and there are others in the room doing various things. Well, is it absolutely necessary to have accounted for those, or could you easily omit accounting for those in your usability engineering? You certainly could omit accounting for those. You might do your usability testing using only a surgeon, right? It would make sense. You would say, oh, I did this and I tested it. But did that really explore the depths of the usability of the device? No, not if it's common practice to have all those people in the room and to have them each looking at the device in a different way. Now, that may get complicated because in one suite or in one hospital system, they may approach it with a certain set of trained personnel in one instance and a different set of trained personnel in another one. And so it's going to be really hard to capture every usability context. So gross oversimplifications would be areas of concern. There's always going to be nuance that you're going to capture. I think I want to emphasize that with respect to usability. And I will go back to a statement that I may have made on the show previously. One time we were listening to somebody from FDA, and they made the point that every device cleared to the market is, present tense, an investigational device. You will never have a perfect risk analysis. You will never have a perfect clinical trial. You will never have a perfect usability evaluation. But the goal is to capture the things such that when the FDA reviews it, they really can't raise any questions. They say, yeah, that's a pretty good analysis. Let's put this thing on the market, and as data comes up, let's be responsive to it. Let's correct for it. And if we do discover issues, let's move forward. That's why databases like MAUDE exist, to capture those things so that our consensus and our understanding of devices can grow. But I think you've put your finger on another important topic, which is who's actually in the room using the device. I can think of something like an asthma inhaler, a combination product to deliver asthma medication. Well, it's probably mostly the patient. And if it works for the patient of all ages and demographics, then we're probably in good shape. But when you get to complex devices, or devices where it might be a clinician in one case and a parent in the other case, or it might be a trained surgeon in one case, or a nurse also highly trained, but in a different set of things in the other case, does it always work the same way? Do they always respond to it the same way? I think it's a really important question to be asking. That would go into the usability engineering file. That would get registered as a potential user of the device. Here's a use case of the device. Basically, let's role play it. Let's find out where the failure modes could be. Then let's give it to real users and see if they fail there or see if they don't. If they do, what are we doing? As we've said before, the most important thing is to design that safety in, right? To make it so the device doesn't allow it to fail in that way. The next thing would be to put some kind of a safety on the device. Kind of like putting an airbag on the car. We can't stop you from crashing the car, but we can try to help if you do. And the third is information for use, to put information in the labeling or in the product packaging in some way, excuse me, such that If you happen to read the IFU, as was the case in the example that we used today, you would know about this. But if you don't, you may go on using the device like you always have and discovering that, in fact, there was something that you missed that could have been known because the company that made the device actually did know about that peripheral sort of thing. Wonderful questions today. I can't tell you how much I appreciate the questions. I think one of the things you've told us today is that there is a lot of appetite for usability, so we may well do a future session on usability because it's really important. It goes right into your development process. And again, for those who are asking, we'll follow up afterwards, but think about it this way: design controls, how you manage the process of what goes in, specifics around standards, risk analysis, user needs, and usability all have to make their way into that process. It's a bit of art, it's a bit of science, but it's really important to do. And then you're able to say, in the end, you're able to say we're done because we've addressed each of these things that we discovered. And until more are discovered, we're at a good place for this product. Let's go get it cleared. Let's go get it on the market, and let's do something cool with it for humanity. I have to say once again, I'm so appreciative of all of you and all the people that we've interacted with recently who both treated and cared for our family, and also everyone behind the scenes who developed the devices that we've come to rely on and have been staring at for the past number of weeks. And it's been a wonderful, wonderful experience with all this health technology. Leave it open for one more minute for anyone with announcements for the community. Anything else you want to tell us about the community, announcements of events that are happening, things that you think people in the MedTech community should submit to and reach out for. We'd love to hear from you. We'll give just about another 30 seconds. Thank you all for the discussion. We appreciate you today. And we'll see you next Friday on MedTech Crossroads, where it's going to be our judges, our pitch party judges are coming back to tell us about what they don't like to see in pitches. After that, more announcements on the committee, as well as the pitch party all next month. We're looking forward to it. Thanks again. Have a great and a beautiful weekend. Talk to you soon.